What happens when an ordinary person makes one bold decision to change the lives of countless others? Stay tuned as we unravel the shocking twist that takes this simple act of kindness from heartwarming to life-altering. You won't believe how this story ends. Watch till the very last second. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you subscribe. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next. The doors of the high-end department store swung open with a soft chime, drawing the attention of the few well-dressed patrons scattered among the sleek marble floors and glass displays. The store was pristine, every corner gleaming, each shelf meticulously arranged with luxurious goods. Shiny watches, designer handbags, expensive perfumes, and exclusive clothing lines. It was the kind of place where even the air seemed to smell like wealth. In the midst of it all, an elderly man entered. His slow, deliberate steps were muffled by the hum of the air conditioning and the chatter of the customers. Earl Washington was in his late 70s, but his presence commanded a kind of quiet dignity that few of the young, busy shoppers seemed to notice. He wore a modest, well-worn gray suit, a black wool hat perched gently on his head, and shoes that had clearly seen better days. His skin, dark and weathered, told stories of a life spent in the sun. Life in small towns, at protests, in classrooms, and around kitchen tables discussing change. He wasn't a man who screamed wealth or status, but rather someone who moved through the world with a calm, unhurried grace. The store was loud with the chatter of the elite, voices carrying the unmistakable tone of people who believed the world owed them something. As Earl took another step inside, the shoes of those around him clicked with purpose. But Earl's steps were softer, slower, as though he were a spectator to a show that didn't concern him, yet he was there to witness it. He stopped in front of a glass case filled with diamond-studded watches and asked the nearest sales assistant, a young woman in her 20s, her name tag reading Vanessa, if she could tell him the price of the first watch in the display. She barely looked up. It's $5,000, Vanessa replied, flicking her gaze up to meet his eyes for just a moment before returning to the task of folding a blouse. Her voice carried an edge of impatience, like she'd been asked the same question too many times already. She assumed he wasn't serious. Earl nodded, unfazed. He gave the watch one last lingering look, his expression unreadable, before moving on to the next display. The next item, a leather jacket, caught his attention. It was sleek, a deep, almost royal shade of black, the kind of jacket you could wear to a gala or a night out in a luxury car. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing something important. "How much for this one?" he asked, his voice calm but purposeful. Vanessa, still folding clothes, didn't even glance up. "$6,000, she said with a slight roll of her eyes. The tone was dismissive, as though she couldn't fathom why an old man would be interested in something so extravagant. $6,000, Earl repeated, mulling the number over. "A bit much for a jacket, don't you think?" Vanessa let out an exasperated sigh. "I don't set the prices, sir." Her tone was starting to border on condescending, but Earl seemed oblivious to the shift. He was already walking toward another display. A series of diamond-studded cufflinks glinted under the lights, their gleam almost mocking in the context of his modest appearance. "And these?" he asked, looking up from the cufflinks to Vanessa. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking from his wrinkled hands to his worn shoes, assessing him the way one might appraise an old book on a shelf. Too dusty, too out of place. $12,000, she answered quickly, her voice flat. "Is there anything else?" For a moment, Earl didn't answer. He merely stood there staring at the cufflinks with a kind of quiet reverence, as though each piece was far more than its price tag, but something deeper, something more meaningful than any of them realized. "Actually," he said, breaking the silence, "I'll take them all." Vanessa blinked. At first, she thought it was a joke. His voice so calm, his request so absurd. She scanned the racks again, looking for signs that he was playing a prank, but there were none. Earl's face was unreadable, his posture unwavering. It was as though, in the sea of glitzy products, He saw something the others did not, something worth more than any price. "I'm sorry," she said, a touch of laughter in her voice. "Did you mean to ask about one item, sir?" "No," Earl said, shaking his head slowly. "I'll buy everything." Vanessa froze. She looked around the store, unsure of how to respond. Was this some kind of joke? Maybe he was just confused. But something in Earl's steady gaze made her hesitate. His face, though aged and lined, was not filled with the frailty she expected. There was a quiet power in his eyes, a depth she couldn't quite place. I'll need to check with the manager," Vanessa muttered, her voice trailing off. She turned and walked briskly to the back of the store, but Earl didn't watch her. His focus was on the items before him, his fingers grazing the edges of the expensive leather bags, the polished glass shelves, the perfect lines of high-end goods. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sense of doubt, as if he had done this before. Vanessa came back moments later with the store manager, a man in his 40s, sharply dressed in a suit that practically screamed authority. He sized Earl up quickly. Another old man, probably in for a brief distraction. Earl had become just another blip on his radar, another day of managing the whims of the rich and entitled. "Good afternoon, sir," the manager said, offering a smile that was just a little too polished. "I understand you were interested in purchasing a few items. May I help you?" Earl didn't smile. He simply repeated his request, more firmly now. "I'd like to buy everything in the store, every item, and have it delivered to the Salvation House shelter." The manager raised an eyebrow, his mouth twitching with disbelief. For a moment, he simply stared at Earl, unsure of how to respond. Maybe this was a prank. Maybe Earl was someone's grandfather, a harmless old man playing a game. "You're serious?" the manager asked, finally breaking the silence. Earl nodded, his eyes unwavering. "Very well," the manager said, the skepticism lingering in his tone. "I'll need to get some information from you." The transaction began, but Earl remained calm and composed, as if this was just another errand on a long list. The manager looked at him again, his eyes narrowing. There was something unsettling about the stillness in Earl's gaze, an unspoken authority that seemed to suggest this wasn't a random, ill-considered whim. Vanessa, still standing nearby, watched the exchange in stunned silence. Her mind was spinning. This couldn't be real, could it? The old man standing there, asking to buy everything in the store, to donate it to a shelter. She had to be missing something, and in that moment, as Earl's calm, deliberate movements continued to unfold in front of her, something clicked. This wasn't just an old man making a ridiculous request. This was something else, something deeper, something that she, in her impatience and assumptions, hadn't even begun to understand. The quiet hum of the store seemed to fade away as Vanessa found herself wondering about the man she had written off, the man who was quietly reshaping her expectations. But as the manager finalized the sale and Earl continued his peaceful transaction, no one noticed yet the storm of change about to unfold. The store buzzed with the soft rustle of luxury goods being moved around and the faint murmur of whispered conversations, but all of it seemed distant now. Vanessa stood behind the counter, her eyes fixed on Earl, who was still standing at the front, calmly waiting for the completion of his purchase. The store manager was on the phone, his expression unreadable as he confirmed the details of the large transaction. Vanessa's mind raced, her thoughts clashing with each other. Who is this man? She had seen him enter, dismissing him like everyone else. A frail old man in worn clothes who seemed so out of place in the opulent store. But now, as she watched him in the center of the room, his steady gaze not wavering, his posture unchanged, it was clear that he wasn't some helpless elderly man stumbling through life. There was something profound about him, something that seemed to fill the space around him, despite the elegant surroundings. Why was he here? She thought again, the question looping in her mind. She had been irritated by his questions earlier, dismissing him like everyone else, assuming he was lost, or worse, playing some sort of joke. But now, with the purchase nearly completed, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about material wealth. She caught herself staring at him, her brow furrowing. Could he really be serious? The thought gnawed at her. What would a man like him, dressed as he was, want with so many high-end items, and to donate them no less? Meanwhile, Earl stood quietly at the front, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing out through the windows to the bustling street outside. He didn't need to look at the price tags anymore. He'd asked all the questions he needed to ask. The sales assistants, the manager, the puzzled onlookers, all of them had been part of a different world, a world where price tags defined worth and status determined value. Earl had no interest in that. Not today. His eyes, sharp despite his age, flickered over to a group of young men standing in front of a display of sports cars. They were laughing loudly, leaning against the shiny exterior of the latest model, each of them holding a drink as if the car were a trophy to be flaunted. One of the men, a tall, well-dressed figure with a slick haircut, caught Earl's gaze and raised an eyebrow in mocking curiosity. Earl didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, a smile that reached his eyes. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who had seen far too much to be intimidated by a laugh or a sneer. He wasn't here for their approval. Everything in the store, including the cars, he had said earlier, and now, as the final details of the transaction were being worked out, he found himself at peace with the decision. It wasn't about the things. It was about the people who needed them. And he had come here with a purpose, one that was starting to unfurl in ways even he hadn't anticipated. Across the store, the manager hung up the phone. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, his face flushed with the realization that he was dealing with something far beyond his daily routine. "All right, Mr. Washington," the manager said, walking toward him with a look of cautious respect. "The purchase has been processed. It will take a few hours to organize everything for delivery. As you requested, we'll send it all to the Salvation House shelter. You'll receive the confirmation soon." Earl nodded, his expression unchanged. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady but carrying an unspoken weight. Vanessa watched, still trying to process the surreal nature of the transaction. She couldn't wrap her mind around it. Who was this man, really? She found herself walking over to the counter, the urge to ask him more questions tugging at her. But before she could open her mouth, a voice interrupted. "Hey, old man," a brash voice called out. It was Liam, the young man who had been laughing earlier in front of the sports cars. He swaggered toward Earl, his smile wide but tinged with mockery. "I don't mean to interrupt your little shopping spree, but you do realize there's no way you can afford all this, right?" Earl turned to face him, his calm gaze meeting Liam's with the same quiet authority. The young man, dressed in an expensive suit that looked more like a costume than a reflection of his true self, grinned at him. "I mean," Liam continued, his tone patronizing, "what exactly are you trying to prove here? You can't seriously think that you belong in a place like this." His voice was louder now, designed to be overheard by the others in the store. The sales assistants, Vanessa included, turned toward the exchange. Their curiosity was palpable, but no one stepped in. The store, a place of wealth and exclusivity, seemed to revel in these moments of tension. It was, in a strange way, expected. People like Earl didn't fit in here. Earl didn't flinch. He stood tall, the faintest of smiles playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "I'm doing what needs to be done." Liam scoffed. "Sure. A nice little charity project, I get it," he said, clearly enjoying the chance to belittle Earl. "But what makes you think you're any better than the rest of us? You can't just throw money around and expect respect." Earl tilted his head slightly, studying Liam for a moment. Then, without missing a beat, he replied, "Respect isn't something that's bought. It's earned. And the only way to earn it is to give it away first." The words hung in the air, and for a moment Liam seemed to lose his swagger. The store manager, sensing the rising tension, stepped in. "All right, gentlemen, there's no need for any more of this," he said, his voice sharp. "Mr. Washington, everything is taken care of. You're free to go whenever you're ready." Earl nodded, his attention returning to the doorway. As he turned to leave, he paused briefly, glancing back at the group. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, The most important things aren't the ones we can see with our eyes. With that, he walked out the door, his cane tapping lightly against the polished floor as the murmurs of the store began to settle. Vanessa stood still for a moment, unsure of what had just happened. Liam, meanwhile, was left with nothing but his own confusion, his confidence cracking under the weight of Earl's quiet words. And as Earl disappeared into the world outside, the store felt just a little less shiny, a little less certain of its own importance. Vanessa couldn't stop thinking about what he had said. The most important things aren't the ones we can see with our eyes. Those words echoed in her mind as she returned to her duties. But as the hours passed, she realized something she hadn't expected. The more she thought about Earl, the more she began to question the life she had been living. The questions lingered like a growing storm. What if, just maybe, there was more to this world than the price tags and labels we clung to? The days that followed Earl's purchase were filled with an eerie quiet that lingered in the department store, like the calm before a storm. Vanessa couldn't shake the image of him from her mind. His presence, so out of place, had somehow left an indelible mark on her. It wasn't just the strangeness of the request, buying everything in the store of all things. It was the way he had carried himself. The calm, unhurried manner in which he had handled the entire situation had an air of quiet defiance, as if he was unshaken by the world's judgments. Vanessa found herself thinking about him at odd moments, while folding clothes, while ringing up customers, even as she walked home from her shift. His words echoed in her head. Respect isn't something that's bought. It's earned. And the only way to earn it is to give it away first. She found herself wondering if he was right, if there was more to life than what she had always assumed. She hadn't expected the order to be fulfilled so quickly. The next day, a delivery truck arrived at the Salvation House shelter, a modest building tucked away on the outskirts of the city. The residents of the shelter, who had become accustomed to the quiet routine of their lives, were shocked as the truck began unloading boxes upon boxes of high-end clothing, furniture, electronics, and enough bags to fill an entire store. The shelter, which had long struggled to keep its doors open, was now flooded with luxury items. There were designer coats, shiny new shoes, plush sofas, kitchen appliances that many had only dreamed of. Miriam, the shelter director, stood at the front, watching the surreal scene unfold before her eyes. She had been expecting a few donations, maybe some canned goods, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "Where did all this come from?" one of the volunteers asked, his voice a mix of confusion and awe. Miriam shook her head, still trying to process it. "I don't know, but whoever it was, they've changed everything." Back at the store, Vanessa had a chance to see the donation in person later that afternoon. The manager had mentioned the delivery in passing, though his tone was still full of skepticism. "Yeah, that guy, Washington. He really pulled through. The stuff's all been dropped off at that shelter. Not that we've got anything to do with it anymore, right?" He chuckled, though his eyes still held an edge of disbelief. But Vanessa wasn't laughing. She couldn't. The donation, this act of generosity, had stirred something inside her, something she hadn't expected. Curiosity gnawed at her. She had to see it for herself. She told the manager she was taking her lunch break and left the store. It wasn't far to the shelter. It was only a short bus ride away. When she arrived, she stood for a moment outside, uncertain. The shelter, despite the abundance of new items inside, still felt worn, tired, almost fragile. But then she stepped through the door. The sight before her was a strange contrast to the usual cramped utilitarian space she had expected. Everywhere she looked, there was luxury. Leather chairs, flat-screen TVs, carefully arranged clothing racks. For a moment, she could barely comprehend it. The first person she saw was Miriam, who was bustling between the rooms, directing volunteers, organizing the influx of goods. She was clearly in her element, calm, yet filled with an unmistakable energy. "Excuse me," Vanessa called out, stepping forward. Miriam turned, her face lighting up when she saw her. "Vanessa, you made it. I wasn't sure if you were going to come by." She paused, her smile faltering slightly as she seemed to sense Vanessa's confusion. I take it you've seen the delivery? Vanessa nodded, still in awe. I don't understand. Who would do this? Miriam's expression softened. You mean Mr. Washington? He didn't just bring clothes or things. He brought dignity. Her eyes held a quiet gratitude as she glanced around at the new additions to the shelter. It's more than just stuff. It's a lifeline for these people, something they've never had access to. What he did, it's not about buying things, it's about giving them a chance. Vanessa swallowed hard, trying to process the weight of Miriam's words. But why? Why him? He didn't even look like he could afford all this. Miriam chuckled softly, shaking her head. That's the point, isn't it? You look at someone and think you know their story. But you don't. Mr. Washington's life. It's a whole different world than what you or I see. She paused, as if considering whether to share more. He didn't just wake up one day and decide to be generous. He's been helping people quietly for decades. It's just who he is. Giving back. It's a part of him. Vanessa's mind spun. The old man who had seemed so out of place in the store was a stranger to her. But this man, this generous benefactor, was someone Miriam clearly knew. There was more to Earl Washington than she had assumed. Can I meet him? Vanessa asked, before she even realized she was speaking. Miriam looked at her curiously but nodded. Sure, he's around here somewhere. He's always popping in to check on things. Vanessa followed Miriam deeper into the shelter. The volunteers were busy sorting donations, some of them looking as stunned as she had been when they first saw the delivery. The smell of fresh fabric and new furniture mixed with the usual scents of the shelter, the faint mustiness of old wood, the soft scent of cleaning supplies. It felt strange in a way, almost like a dream. As they walked down a hallway toward the back rooms, Vanessa noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. A photograph, framed and hanging on the wall, showed Earl Washington standing at a protest, his face young but unmistakable. He was surrounded by people, holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." The image was old, faded at the edges, but the fire in his eyes was still visible. Vanessa felt a lump rise in her throat. She had no idea who this man was, but there was something about the way he stood, the pride and defiance in his gaze, that made her feel like she had missed something important. They reached the back of the shelter where Earl was sitting in a worn leather chair, speaking quietly to a group of children. His voice was calm and steady as he listened, offering words of wisdom that seemed to settle over them like a warm blanket. He looked up as Vanessa approached, his eyes bright with the same quiet strength she had seen before. "You're the young lady from the store," he said, his voice like the soft rasp of a well-worn record. There was no judgment in his tone, only a faint trace of curiosity. Vanessa nodded, feeling suddenly unsure of herself. I came to thank you for everything. I don't understand it, but I want to." Earl smiled, but there was no pride in it. It was simply a smile of recognition, as if he had known this moment was coming all along. "You don't need to thank me," he said gently. "You only need to understand that giving isn't about money. It's about seeing the people who need it and giving them what you can, without hesitation." Vanessa stood there for a long moment, her mind racing, the weight of his words settling deep into her chest. There was so much she hadn't understood, so much she had missed. The world she had always known, the store, the hustle, the competition for wealth, suddenly seemed so small. And for the first time she wondered if maybe Earl Washington had just shown her a glimpse of something bigger, something far more important than the world of price tags and labels. As she left the shelter that evening, the sun was setting, casting a soft golden light across the streets. For the first time in a long while, Vanessa didn't feel lost. She felt like she was starting to understand something she had been blind to her entire life. Earl Washington had come into her world, and without her even realizing it, had begun to change everything. Over the following weeks, Vanessa found herself thinking about Earl Washington more than she cared to admit. She couldn't stop wondering who he was, what kind of life he had lived, and what had driven him to such extraordinary acts of generosity. There was a restlessness inside her now, a kind of quiet longing to understand something deeper about the world and her place in it. The changes at the shelter were impossible to ignore. Every day, new people came in to volunteer, inspired by the abundance Earl had brought. The children had new clothes, the elderly had comfortable new chairs to sit in, and the residents who once relied on hand-me-downs were now walking around in brand new shoes and jackets. The shelter itself was no longer the drab utilitarian space it had been. It had transformed into something that resembled a home, a place where people could rebuild, not just survive. Vanessa visited regularly. At first, it was to see if she could get more insight into Earl. Miriam, ever gracious, had become more open about the man's background, though she rarely spoke about him in depth. It seemed that Earl had an unspoken rule about his privacy. "He doesn't like to talk about himself," Miriam explained one day as they sat together in the shelter's small break room. "He doesn't think his past matters. It's what he's doing now that counts." Vanessa sat back, processing this new piece of information. She understood it in a way. Earl wasn't the kind of person who needed to boast or to explain his motives. But she needed to know. She needed to understand what had shaped him into the person he was today. One day, after another long shift at the store, Vanessa found herself standing in front of Earl's modest apartment building. She hadn't planned to come here. It was more of a compulsion. She had no idea whether he'd even be home, or whether he would want to see her again. But there was something she needed to say, something she needed to ask. As she walked up the creaky stairs of the building, she felt her heart beat faster. She had never done anything like this before, gone out of her way to seek someone out, especially someone so different from her. But something inside her told her it was the right thing to do. Earl's apartment was on the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled faintly of old wood and musty carpet. Vanessa hesitated for a moment before knocking gently on the door. There was no response, so she knocked again, a little louder this time. It was several moments before the door creaked open, revealing Earl in the same worn gray suit, his hat perched on his head. His face lit up in recognition, but there was no surprise in his eyes, as though he had expected her. "Vanessa," he said, his voice warm but calm. "I see you've come to find me." Vanessa faltered, unsure of how to begin. "I wanted to talk to you. I've been thinking about everything you said, about the shelter, about generosity. And I don't understand. I don't understand how you do it, how you just give everything away. Don't you ever wonder what it means for you?" Earl stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come in," he said simply, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped inside, immediately struck by the simplicity of the space. The apartment was small, but neat. There were no frills, no luxurious items, just a modest couch, a table with a few books stacked on it, and photographs scattered across the walls. The pictures were mostly of people, men and women of different ages, some familiar, some unfamiliar to her. Earl motioned for Vanessa to sit in the armchair by the window, which offered a view of the city skyline, now dimming with the glow of the evening sun. "I don't know how to explain it to you, Vanessa," Earl began, sitting across from her. "It's not about the things we accumulate. Those things, clothes, money, food, they don't define us, they never did. I didn't start giving away my possessions because I felt sorry for people. I started because I realized that if I don't do something with what I have, then I'm wasting it." Vanessa listened intently, the words settling in her chest. "But don't you ever think about yourself? Don't you want to enjoy what you've earned? You've worked hard, right?" Earl paused, his eyes softening as he looked out the window for a moment. "I've had my time of enjoying things, but there comes a point in your life when you start to see what really matters. You realize that the world doesn't need more wealthy people hoarding things. What the world needs are people who know how to share." Vanessa swallowed hard, trying to digest this. "I don't know. I've always thought you had to have money, things. Otherwise, how can you survive?" Earl smiled gently. I know how you feel. I was there once too. But survival isn't the same as living. Sometimes living means giving someone else a chance to survive. And sometimes it means giving them the dignity of having something they never thought they could have. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening even more. Money can't buy dignity, Vanessa, no matter how much you have. Vanessa's mind was reeling. The simple truth of his words cut through the barriers she'd built around herself. She had spent years working long hours at the store, chasing commission, obsessing over promotions, accumulating things she didn't need, all in the name of success. But none of it had ever felt as fulfilling as the way she felt sitting here, in this quiet apartment, hearing Earl speak. She felt small in comparison to him, but in a way that wasn't judgmental. It wasn't about being less than him. It was about realizing that her idea of success had been all wrong. You don't have to explain it, Earl, Vanessa said, a new sense of clarity in her voice. I think I'm starting to understand. Earl nodded, as though he had been waiting for her to get there. I'm not asking anyone to live like I do. We all have our paths, but the world will always be better when we open our eyes to the people around us, when we see them not as problems to solve, but as people who deserve something better. There was a long silence, one that stretched between them comfortably, until Vanessa finally spoke again. Do you ever miss it? The life you had before? All the things? Earl thought for a moment. Sometimes, but I've learned that we hold on to the wrong things. I miss the people who were in my life, my friends, my family. But I don't miss the things I thought I needed. Vanessa nodded slowly. I think I want to be more like you, she said, almost whispering the words, as if testing them in her own mind. I want to start seeing people for who they really are, not just what they can give me. Earl's eyes softened with a kindness that reached deep inside her. Then you're already on your way. As Vanessa stood to leave, she felt a strange lightness in her chest, as though something inside her had shifted, something she hadn't even known needed to be changed. Earl had shown her a new way of looking at the world, a way that didn't revolve around possessions or status, but around people. The door closed behind her, and as she stepped into the cool evening air, she found herself looking up at the stars for the first time in what felt like forever. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer chasing after the wrong things. Earl Washington had given her something far more valuable than all the things she'd ever wanted. He had given her a glimpse of what it meant to truly live. The days after her visit to Earl's apartment felt different. Vanessa felt as though a door had opened in her mind, one she hadn't even realized was closed. Her shifts at the store no longer felt like an endless treadmill of repetitive tasks and empty transactions. Instead, each day became an opportunity for reflection, for looking at people differently, and for questioning the world she had spent so much time trying to fit into. But as she wrestled with her newfound perspective, the realities of her life still pressed on her. The store, her coworkers, the relentless pressure to sell. It all felt somehow disconnected from the values Earl had shown her. She could no longer shake the feeling that she was caught between two worlds, the one she had always known and the one she was just beginning to understand. Her interactions with her co-workers began to shift too. Vanessa found herself less interested in the small talk that had once consumed her conversations. She couldn't bring herself to talk about the latest fashion trends or gossip about the newest celebrity. Her mind kept drifting back to the shelter, to the people she had met there, and to Earl. She saw everything through a new lens now, one that made her question what really mattered. One afternoon, while she was helping a customer at the register, she overheard a conversation between two of the sales assistants, Julie and Sarah. They were talking about the latest charity event the store was sponsoring, a gala that promised to raise funds for underprivileged communities. Vanessa didn't know the specifics, but it was clear that the event wasn't about the people who needed help. It was about the store's image. She couldn't stop herself from eavesdropping as Julie made a comment that twisted something inside her. Can you believe they're letting that old man, what was his name again? Earl Washington, sponsor part of the event? Julie scoffed. I mean, I get that he's giving away all that stuff, but who really cares about charity, you know? It's just for show. It's about looking good in front of people who matter. Sarah nodded in agreement. Yeah, it's all about optics. I mean, what's he going to do with all those fancy clothes and electronics? It's just a PR stunt. The word struck Vanessa like a slap in the face. She knew they weren't speaking about Earl directly, but their dismissive tone made her stomach churn. She had seen it firsthand, the difference between what they thought charity was and what it truly meant. These weren't people who gave for the sake of giving. They gave because it made them look good, because it earned them praise in a world that thrived on superficiality. The anger that surged inside her was surprising, but it wasn't just anger. It was something deeper. It was a recognition of the distance between the world she had been part of and the world Earl had shown her. A world where giving wasn't about appearances, but about real change. That night, as Vanessa sat alone in her small apartment, she couldn't stop thinking about it. The more she thought about the store's charity event, the more she realized how hollow it felt. She had been part of it, yes, but she had never truly understood what it meant. The charity wasn't aimed at lifting people up. It was designed to make the store look benevolent, to show off their commitment to social causes, without ever changing the root of the problem. She pulled out her phone, searching for the details of the event. It was to be held at a luxury hotel, a glamorous affair with wine and hors d'oeuvres. The tickets were exorbitantly priced, and the guest list read like a who's who of society's elite. Vanessa couldn't help but scoff. It was the perfect example of what Earl had been talking about. It wasn't about the people in need. It was about selling an image. Suddenly, something clicked. What if I could do something different? What if she could take part in a kind of charity that was truly about giving, not about flaunting her success? Earl had already shown her the path. Now it was her turn to decide if she was brave enough to walk it. The next morning, she called Miriam at the shelter. She had made a decision. I want to help. For real. I want to do something that makes a difference, Vanessa said, her voice steady, but with a sense of urgency that surprised her. Miriam was quiet for a moment, then responded with the warmth that had always characterized her. I'm glad you called, Vanessa. But what do you have in mind? Vanessa hesitated, then took a deep breath. I want to host an event, a real one. Not for the people who just want to throw their money around for a good photo op, but for the people who actually need it. People from the shelter and other shelters in the area. An event where they get what they need. Clothes, food, medical care, maybe even job opportunities. But it's not going to be for show. It's going to be for them. Miriam's voice softened. You're talking about a community event. Something that empowers people. You're serious about this, aren't you? Yes, Vanessa said firmly. I'm serious. It wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a plan, and it was going to be hard. Vanessa didn't have experience running events, especially ones as ambitious as this. But what she had was passion, and she had a new understanding of what it meant to give, what it meant to really see people for who they were, not for the labels society placed on them. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa worked tirelessly, reaching out to local businesses, community organizations, and people she knew through the shelter. She wasn't just looking for donations. She was looking for a shift in mindset, for people to understand that charity was more than a handout. It was a partnership. People needed opportunities, not just things. She visited Earl a few times to update him on her plans. Every time she told him more about the event, she saw the quiet approval in his eyes, though he never took credit. He simply listened, offered advice when needed, and reminded her that the most important thing was to stay focused on the people who mattered. A week before the event, Vanessa sat in the shelter's small meeting room, her mind racing as Miriam handed her a stack of flyers. This is it, Miriam said, her tone a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The people are starting to talk about it. The buzz is real. You've done something good here, Vanessa. You've brought the community together. Vanessa smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. But deep down, she knew the hard part was yet to come. The event might be a success, but it would only matter if the people who came truly felt seen and supported, if they walked away with more than just a few handouts. As the day of the event drew closer, Vanessa's nervousness grew, but so did her sense of purpose. She had stepped into a new world, one that Earl had shown her, and now it was her turn to make a difference, no matter how small the step. The night before the event, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she thought about the people she had met at the shelter, the conversations she'd had, and the quiet wisdom Earl had shared with her. There was still so much to learn, but one thing was certain: she was ready to begin. And with that thought, she closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would be the first step in her new journey. The morning of the event arrived with a rush of activity. Vanessa barely slept the night before, her mind buzzing with last-minute details. She had barely enough time to get dressed and grab a cup of coffee before she found herself at the shelter, overseeing the final preparations. Tables were being set up, banners hung, volunteers scurried about with bags of supplies, and the whole place hummed with nervous energy. Despite the excitement, there was also an undercurrent of anxiety in the air. Would people show up? Would it be enough? Vanessa had put everything she had into this event, and now it was out of her hands. All she could do was hope that the community she had worked so hard to bring together would come through. By the time the first guests arrived, the shelter had transformed into something entirely different. Instead of the drab, overstuffed space it had been, it now resembled a bustling, welcoming center. There were booths offering free health checks, tables stacked with donated clothing, even a corner where volunteers were offering resume-building workshops. There were hot meals being served, and live music played softly in the background. Vanessa had managed to bring together a small army of local businesses, doctors, and volunteers who, like her, were tired of charity as an image exercise and wanted to make real change. As the event began, Vanessa walked through the crowd, checking in with the volunteers and talking to guests. She could see the difference in their faces. They weren't just walking through the motions of receiving charity. They were interacting, making connections, and even helping one another. There was a feeling of dignity in the air, a sense of empowerment that had been missing from many of the typical charity events Vanessa had been involved with in the past. This wasn't a show for the rich and powerful to parade their generosity. It was a real opportunity for people to feel valued, to gain resources that would help them take the next step in their lives. Among the crowd, Vanessa spotted a familiar face. Miriam was speaking with a group of residents, explaining the different programs available, but when she saw Vanessa, her face lit up. "It's a success, Vanessa," she said with pride, her voice full of gratitude. "You've done something incredible here. Look around. People are talking to each other, helping each other. This is what it's all about." Vanessa felt a rush of emotion flood through her. She had spent so many years feeling like a small cog in a larger, impersonal machine, chasing after promotions and recognition in a job that didn't matter. But this was something real. She had made this happen, and it was changing lives. People were laughing, connecting, asking for advice. The tables piled with clothes were slowly being emptied as people found new items. The free health checkups had a long line of people, and the food was being devoured with gratitude. Then, as if on cue, Vanessa felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned around to find Earl standing there, leaning slightly on his cane, his face serious but filled with quiet approval. "I knew you had it in you," he said softly, the weight of his words carrying a deep sense of pride that made Vanessa's chest tighten. "You came," she said, almost surprised. Earl smiled, his eyes twinkling with something that wasn't just amusement but understanding. "Of course I came. You think I would miss this?" He nodded toward the crowd. "This is what it's all about. People looking out for each other, not for the photo ops, but for the real stuff." Vanessa was speechless for a moment. All her hard work, the long nights, the constant questioning of whether she was doing enough. It felt worth it now, in that moment. But there was something more than just the success of the event in Earl's words. It was the reminder that the real work wasn't in the event itself. It was in the people who were making the effort to connect, to rebuild their lives, to empower one another. The day wore on, and as the event wound down, Vanessa looked around at the room full of people. There were faces she didn't recognize, but there were also those she'd seen at the shelter. The same residents who had once looked at her with confusion or skepticism, now chatting animatedly, their hands full of bags of donated clothes or new opportunities. She caught a few glimpses of people signing up for job interviews, others discussing future classes they could take to improve their skills, and everywhere, there was a sense of belonging. It wasn't until late afternoon that Vanessa finally had a moment to herself. The event was winding down, and most of the guests had started to leave, but there was still a sense of warmth in the air. She leaned against the doorframe of one of the back rooms, taking a moment to absorb everything that had happened. Her heart was still racing from the excitement, but she felt a deep sense of peace settling over her. She had done something meaningful, not for the store's bottom line, not for her own image, but for real people who needed it. As she stood there, a voice from behind her broke her reverie. "You've done a good thing, Vanessa." She turned to find Miriam standing there, a gentle smile on her face. "Thank you," Vanessa said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without your help." "You did this," Miriam said with quiet conviction. "You put this all together, you made it happen, and you're just getting started. There's more you can do, Vanessa. You've already opened a door that leads to so much more." Vanessa didn't respond immediately, but the words lingered in her mind. What else could she do? The event had been a start, but it was only the beginning of a much larger mission. There was more to be done, so much more. The question was no longer whether she could make a difference, but how far she could take this. How many more people could she help? How many lives could she touch? "Maybe I can do more," she said finally, the thought forming clearly in her mind. "Maybe we all can." Just then, Vanessa heard the sound of footsteps approaching. She turned to find Earl once again, his gaze unwavering. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and steady. "What you did here today, it's just the start. People like you, people who understand what it really means to give, are the ones who can change this world. But it takes time and patience. It takes finding the right partners. I've been doing this a long time, Vanessa. If you're serious about this, about making this more than a one-time thing, you need to start thinking bigger." Vanessa looked at Earl, her heart swelling with gratitude. "What do you mean?" Earl chuckled, a deep, knowing sound. "You have the right heart. But now it's time to build something that lasts. There's no shortage of need in this world. What you did today, it can become a movement, a chance for people like you, people with the right intentions, to take it further." Vanessa's eyes widened. "A movement? You really think so?" Earl nodded. "I know so. But it's up to you. There are others out there who want to help. It's just a matter of finding them and asking them to join you." In that moment, something inside Vanessa shifted again. She realized that this was not just her journey anymore. It was the beginning of something far bigger than herself. What she had started, with Earl's help and Miriam's guidance, was only the first chapter. There were more stories to write, more lives to change. She took a deep breath, ready for whatever was next. She wasn't just a woman working at a retail job anymore. She was someone who had learned the true meaning of giving, and was now ready to share it with the world. The weeks that followed the event were a whirlwind of activity for Vanessa. Earl's words stayed with her, echoing in her mind. "It's up to you." They pushed her, nudging her beyond the boundaries of what she thought was possible. It wasn't enough to simply help a few people. She realized now that what she had started needed to grow, to reach more, to transform the very fabric of how people viewed charity and community support. She began to meet with local business owners, social activists, and even local politicians who had supported the shelter, asking them to help her create a more sustainable long-term plan. She called it the Bridge Initiative, a program aimed at connecting people in need with the resources they needed to rebuild their lives. It was more than just a charity event. It was a network of mutual support, a bridge between those who had the means and those who needed them. The vision was simple but ambitious. Create a sustainable ecosystem where giving wasn't just about donation. It was about partnership, mentorship, and community-driven change. The first step was building partnerships with local job training programs and educational institutions. She reached out to those she knew at the shelter and in her network, asking for their expertise. It wasn't long before people who had once been skeptical of Vanessa's vision began to see the potential. Even some of her co-workers from the store, who had once dismissed her as idealistic, started offering their support, drawn by the sense of purpose Vanessa had discovered. One evening, as she was sitting at her kitchen table working through a list of potential partners and organizations, her phone rang. It was Miriam. "Vanessa," Miriam said, her voice urgent. "I just got a call from someone. He wants to meet with you. Someone who could make a huge difference for your initiative. His name is Thomas Bellamy. He's a philanthropist, and he's heard about the work you've been doing. He wants to help." Vanessa felt a jolt of excitement and hesitation. She had heard of Thomas Bellamy before. He was a well-known figure in the local business and charitable communities, known for his generous donations and involvement in city projects. But he also had a reputation for being hard to approach, for only getting involved in things that had a clear, tangible return on investment. She wasn't sure if this was a stroke of luck or just another PR stunt waiting to happen. "I don't know, Miriam," she said, unsure. "What's his angle? Does he just want to put his name on something for a tax break?" "I don't think so," Miriam responded. "I spoke with his assistant and they seem genuinely interested in your vision. Just hear him out, Vanessa. You never know." Vanessa didn't have much time to think about it. The meeting was scheduled for the next day at one of the city's upscale restaurants, a place she'd never been. Too expensive for her budget, but fitting for someone like Thomas Bellamy. She arrived early, nerves buzzing in her stomach as she entered the sleek modern space. The staff directed her to a private table at the back, where Thomas was already sitting, dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of wealth and influence. "Vanessa, right?" He stood as she approached, offering a firm handshake. His gaze was sharp, calculating, but there was also something behind his eyes that made Vanessa wonder. She couldn't quite place it. "I've heard a lot about you," he said as he gestured for her to sit. "The event you organized, I was impressed. You've got a real drive to make things happen." Vanessa hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm not here to talk about my drive, Mr. Bellamy. I'm here because I believe the Bridge Initiative could make a real difference. It's about creating something sustainable, something that gives people more than just a handout. I'm not interested in superficial gestures or token donations." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether she was the real deal. She didn't flinch. He finally leaned back in his chair, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "I like your honesty. Most people come to me with a laundry list of what they need, but you're talking about long-term change. That's rare. I respect that." Vanessa exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. This was the moment of truth. "What are you offering, then?" she asked, her voice firm. "I need people who are invested in real change, not just a headline." Thomas leaned forward, his fingers steepled on the table. "What if I told you I could provide the funding for your initiative? I'm talking about a sizable investment that could help you scale your programs. In return, I'd like to have a seat at the table when it comes to making decisions about the direction of the project." Vanessa's mind raced. Funding was exactly what she needed, but this felt too easy, too good to be true. She was suddenly wary of his intentions, aware of the power dynamics that could come into play. "And what's the catch?" "No catch," Thomas replied smoothly, though the way he said it made Vanessa uneasy. "But I do want to be involved in shaping the initiative. I've got years of experience in funding projects like yours, and I think we can take this to a citywide scale. Think about it. Your network, my resources. It could change the landscape of how people think about charity. A new model of giving. You'll be the face of it, of course, but I'll be your partner. Vanessa was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. A part of her wanted to jump at the opportunity, to take the funding and run with it. But there was another part of her, the part Earl had awakened in her, that didn't want to lose sight of the core mission. Helping people, not just ticking boxes on a donor's wish list. "You're asking for a lot of influence, Mr. Bellamy," she said cautiously. "I'm not just looking for a financial backer. I want partners who believe in the vision, who are in it for the people, not for the publicity." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm all about results, Vanessa. But you're right. I want real results, too. We can make this a game changer. And if you're as serious as you seem, this could be the start of something big." Vanessa was quiet, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of her water glass. She didn't like the way he phrased things, but she couldn't deny that the opportunity he offered was too tempting to dismiss outright. It was the kind of chance that could propel her initiative into the spotlight. It could provide the resources she desperately needed, but at what cost? "Let me think about it," she said finally, standing up. "I'll need some time to consider everything." Thomas looked at her with a sharp gaze. "Take all the time you need, Vanessa. But remember, opportunities like this don't come around often." As she walked out of the restaurant, her mind was spinning. The offer was huge, but so was the risk. She knew what she wanted to create. A movement grounded in true community, not just philanthropy for show. But could she balance that with the kind of resources Thomas Bellamy could offer? Would she be compromising her values in the process? She thought of Earl, of Miriam, of the people she had met at the shelter. They had shown her what it really meant to give without expectation, without the need for recognition or power. Could she hold on to that purity while navigating the complicated world of high-stakes philanthropy? Vanessa didn't know the answer yet, but she knew one thing: she couldn't go back to the way things were before. She had seen the difference real, meaningful change could make, and she wasn't about to give that up without a fight. The road ahead was uncertain, but Vanessa was no longer afraid of the unknown. She was ready to face it, on her terms. In the days that followed, Vanessa wrestled with the decision. The weight of Thomas Bellamy's offer hung over her like a dark cloud. She spent hours thinking about it, talking it over with Miriam and Earl, even reaching out to a few of the shelter residents she'd grown close to. Each conversation left her with more questions than answers, but also a growing sense that the stakes had never been higher. "Thomas Bellamy is offering you what you need," Miriam said one evening, as they sat in the small meeting room at the shelter. "Funding, exposure, resources, everything you've been working for. Why are you hesitating?" Vanessa glanced down at the pile of papers on the table, her fingers tracing the edges of her notes. "I know what he's offering," she replied slowly, "and I know what the Bridge Initiative could do with that kind of support. But it feels like he's offering it with strings attached. It's too easy, Miriam. I don't want to become just another project with his name on it." Miriam's eyes softened. "I understand, but sometimes you have to accept help from the places you might least expect. The important thing is remembering why you started this in the first place, why you wanted to create a community, not just a charity. You've always said it's about giving people the dignity of choice, not just a handout." Vanessa looked at her, uncertainty still clouding her mind. "But what if I lose control of it? What if it stops being about the people and starts being about the brand? What if I lose the very thing I've been working for?" Miriam leaned forward, her voice quiet but resolute. "You're a strong woman, Vanessa. You know how to lead and you know how to stay true to your values. Trust yourself. Don't let fear hold you back. You'll figure it out, just like you always have. But if you let this opportunity slip away, you might regret it." Vanessa was silent, weighing her options. Her gut told her Miriam was right. This could be the break she needed to take the Bridge Initiative to the next level. But something about the idea of aligning with someone like Thomas Bellamy felt wrong. She thought of the faces she'd seen at the event, people who were desperate, who needed something real, not just another corporate charity campaign. And then she thought about Earl, his quiet wisdom, and his warning about staying true to herself. That night she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, her mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios. The decision gnawed at her, a constant, unshakable presence that wouldn't let her rest. By morning, she had made up her mind. She wasn't ready to give up control. Not yet. Not without knowing she could create something that truly lasted. Vanessa picked up the phone, dialed Miriam's number, and waited for the familiar voice to pick up. "I've made a decision," she said when Miriam answered. Miriam paused, and Vanessa could almost hear her smile. "What did you decide?" "I'm not going to take Bellamy's offer. At least not now," Vanessa said, her voice firm. "I need to build this on my own terms. If it fails, it fails. But I need to know that I did it right. I'm going to keep pushing for the kind of change that's about people, not profit." Miriam let out a relieved breath. "I'm proud of you, Vanessa. It's a hard choice, but it's the right one. You've got the heart to do this, and that's all that matters. Now let's figure out how we make it happen." Vanessa smiled for the first time that day. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. She didn't need the validation of a billionaire's backing or the security of a corporate sponsor. What she had, her vision, her heart, and the people around her, was enough. It wasn't long before Vanessa's decision began to pay off. Word of the Bridge initiative spread. Miriam's network of supporters rallied behind her, and more volunteers came forward. Local businesses, small independent ones, offered to sponsor events, donate supplies, or provide services for free. The initiative was small, but it was growing steadily, and there was an undeniable buzz in the community. People were seeing what Vanessa was doing, and they wanted to be part of it. As the initiative picked up steam, Vanessa found herself meeting more and more people who shared her vision. There was John, a local contractor who had once been homeless and now ran a construction company. He offered to provide free home repairs for families in need. There was Sarah, a former teacher who had retired early and now volunteered to help with resume workshops and job training. It was the kind of support Vanessa had always dreamed of, a grassroots movement, people coming together to make a real difference, not for fame, but for the sake of those who needed it most. And then there was Earl. He had become more than just a mentor to Vanessa. He had become a symbol of the wisdom she needed, a reminder that the work wasn't about quick fixes or grand gestures. It was about staying focused on the long game. One day, a few months after the event, Vanessa sat down with Earl in the same apartment where she had first met him. She had a folder of new proposals in front of her. Plans for a mobile resource center to provide on-the-go support to people living on the streets, a mentorship program to help young people get out of foster care, and a network of local businesses willing to offer job training and apprenticeships. The Bridge Initiative was finally becoming the movement she had always hoped for. "How's it going, Vanessa?" Earl asked, his voice as calm as ever. Vanessa smiled, leaning back in her chair. "It's going, slowly, but it's going. I've got more support than I ever thought I would, and I've learned something important." Earl raised an eyebrow, waiting. Vanessa continued, her voice steady. "I've learned that it's not about the money or the big names. It's about the people. It's about connecting those who have the power to help with those who need it, and making sure it's about more than just charity. It's about creating opportunities. I don't need Bellamy's money. I need the people around me, the ones who really care." Earl nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You've got it, Vanessa. You've figured it out. And that's worth more than any offer or donation." Vanessa sat there for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She realized that what she had created wasn't just a program or an initiative. It was a new way of thinking, a new way of being in the world. And for the first time in her life, she truly felt like she was where she was meant to be. But just as she was about to speak again, there was a knock at the door. Earl glanced at her, a quizzical look in his eyes, then rose to answer it. Standing in the doorway was a man Vanessa didn't recognize. He was tall, sharply dressed and carrying a briefcase. There was something about him that immediately put Vanessa on edge. "Can I help you?" Earl asked, his voice calm but wary. The man stepped forward, flashing a brief smile. "I think we need to talk, Mr. Washington. And, Miss Matthews, I have a proposal for you." Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what this was, but she knew one thing. This was the beginning of something that could change everything. Earl looked at the man carefully, then turned to Vanessa. "It looks like the world's finally catching up with you." Vanessa took a deep breath, her mind racing. Whatever was about to happen, she was ready. The man introduced himself as Andrew Franklin, a lawyer from a firm specializing in social impact investments. His voice was smooth, practiced. He had the air of someone who was used to negotiating high-stakes deals. "I've heard a great deal about your initiative," Andrew said, his gaze focused on Vanessa. "And I believe it's something worth investing in. I represent a group of private donors who are interested in making the Bridge Initiative a major force in the city. We want to fund your vision, and we're prepared to provide significant financial backing to make it happen." Vanessa exchanged a glance with Earl, her pulse quickening. It sounded too good to be true, but there was something else beneath the surface, an undercurrent of calculation that Vanessa couldn't quite ignore. She had just come to terms with her decision to turn down Bellamy's offer, and now this. Another opportunity to scale the initiative, another chance to bring more resources to the people who needed them. But the question lingered. Who were these private donors, and why were they interested in her work now? "We've been following your progress," Andrew continued, "and we believe you have the potential to take this further than anyone else could. We see the value in your grassroots approach, in the way you're integrating local businesses and services into your model. But to take this to the next level, we need to move quickly. This is a one-time offer. I need your answer today." Vanessa stood still, weighing the offer. She had fought so hard to build something that wasn't about the money or the fame, but now it was staring her in the face. The resources, the potential, and yet, the weight of the decision felt like a boulder in her chest. "I need to know more," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "Before I make any decisions, I need to understand exactly what you're offering and what you expect in return."